The jungle had stopped screaming. That was the first thing Corporal James Winters noticed as his ears adjusted to the silence that followed gunfire. The birds had fled. The insects had gone quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if the killing was truly finished. Winters crouched behind a fallen mahogany trunk, his M1 Garand still warm against his shoulder, the smell of cordite mixing with the rot of vegetation and something worse, the copper tang of blood already thick in the humid air. His hands were steady. 3 years in the Pacific had trained that steadiness into him, burned away the farm boy from Ohio who used to shake at the sound of a gunshot during deer season. 6 bodies lay scattered across the trail ahead, 4 Japanese, 2 American. Private Eddie Kowalski from Brooklyn was face down in the mud, half his skull gone. Winters had been talking to him 20 minutes ago about his sister's wedding back home, scheduled for September. Eddie wouldn't make it. Private first class. Raymond Tucker from Georgia sprawled against a tree root, eyes open, staring at nothing, a neat hole just above his collarbone where a Arisaka round had punched through. The jungle reclaimed silence with disturbing speed. Already the flies were gathering. Clear left. Sergeant Frank Dalton's voice cut through the stillness, rough and flat. Winters, check the right flank. Make sure we got them all. Winters rose slowly, weapon raised, moving through the undergrowth with practiced care. His boots squelched in mud that hadn't been mud an hour ago. The rain had stopped during the firefight, but the ground here never dried completely. Everything rotted. Everything decayed. Wood, fabric, flesh. It all became the same soup of decomposition given enough time. The ambush had been sudden and vicious. The Japanese patrol had let them walk directly into the kill zone before opening up from concealed positions on both sides of the trail. Classic tactic. Winters' squad had been lucky. They'd reacted fast, returned fire, pushed through instead of freezing. Dalton had thrown grenades. Somebody, maybe Jackson, had gotten the enemy machine gunner with a lucky shot. The whole thing lasted maybe 90 seconds. 90 seconds that left 8 men dead. Winters pushed through a curtain of broad leaves, their surfaces still trembling from the violence that had shaken them minutes before. The light here was green and dim, filtered through layers of canopy. Vines hung like ropes. The air was so thick it felt like breathing through wet cloth. That's when he saw him. The Japanese soldier sat propped against the massive trunk of a banyan tree, its aerial roots creating a natural cage around him. He was young, probably Winters' age, maybe younger. His uniform was torn and filthy, the color somewhere between brown and gray. Blood soaked through his midsection, dark and spreading, pooling in his lap and staining the exposed roots beneath him. A gut shot. Winters had seen enough of them to know the man was dying, slowly, painfully. The soldier's rifle lay 3 feet away, out of reach. His hands rested on his thighs, palms up, empty. His head tilted back against the tree trunk, eyes closed, face pale beneath the grime. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps. Winters approached carefully, weapon trained on the man's chest. This was the dangerous part. Wounded enemy could still fight, could still detonate grenades, could still kill you if you got careless. But this one didn't move, didn't open his eyes, didn't reach for a weapon. The protocol was clear. No prisoners on patrol. They were too deep in enemy territory, 5 miles from the nearest American position. No medic, no way to evacuate a wounded captive. Command had made the orders explicit. Neutralize all enemy contacts. Don't take chances. Neutralize. That was the word they used. Clean, efficient. It meant kill. Winters had done it before. Twice. Once on Lady, once on Luzon. Both times the enemy soldiers had been too badly wounded to move, beyond saving even if there'd been a field hospital nearby. Both times Winters had told himself it was mercy. Quick, cleaner than letting them bleed out over hours. He raised his rifle now, settling the stock against his shoulder, sighting down the barrel at the Japanese soldier's head. 20 feet. Couldn't miss at this range. 1 shot. The man wouldn't feel it, wouldn't even know. Winters' finger found the trigger. And the soldier began to sing. The sound was so quiet Winters almost missed it beneath his own breathing. A soft hum at first, barely audible. Then words. Japanese words Winters couldn't understand, syllables that meant nothing to him. The melody was simple, rising and falling in a gentle pattern, the kind of tune that suggested comfort, safety, peace. The soldier's eyes remained closed. His lips barely moved. Blood continued to seep through his fingers where they rested on his stomach, but his voice remained steady, quiet, singing to the jungle, to the sky, to no one. And Winters recognized it. Not the words, not the language, but the rhythm, the cadence, the specific pattern of notes that rose and fell like a heartbeat, like breathing, like the gentle rock of a cradle. His mother had sung this to him. The recognition hit Winters like a physical blow, stealing his breath, loosening his grip on the rifle. He was 6 years old again, lying in a narrow bed in a farmhouse outside Cleveland, his mother sitting beside him in the dim glow of a kerosene lamp, her hand on his forehead, her voice soft and low, singing him toward sleep. The melody was identical, not the words. His mother had sung in English. Some old song her own mother had taught her, something about stars and dreams. But the tune, the rhythm, the way each phrase ended with that small descending pattern of notes. It was the same, exactly the same. Winters' finger remained on the trigger, but he couldn't pull it. His hands had started to shake. The rifle barrel wavered, his vision blurred at the edges. The Japanese soldier kept singing, his voice growing weaker, the pauses between phrases lengthening as breathing became harder. He wasn't singing to Winters. He didn't even know Winters was there, standing 10 feet away with a loaded rifle aimed at his head. He was singing to someone else, someone far away, across the ocean, perhaps to a child or a mother, or a memory of home before the war swallowed everything. Winters' mother had died when he was 7. Pneumonia, the doctor said. Though there wasn't much doctoring to be done by the time they realized how sick she was. She'd lasted 3 days, feverish and struggling to breathe. And on the last night, when Winters' father had finally let him into her room to say goodbye, she'd tried to sing to him, the same lullaby. But she'd been too weak, could only manage a few notes before coughing overtook her. He'd forgotten the melody, or thought he had. Buried it somewhere deep alongside the grief and the empty years that followed, when his father turned silent and the farm turned gray and childhood ended abruptly in a too-quiet house. But here it was again, sung by a dying enemy soldier in a jungle on the other side of the world, in a language Winters couldn't understand. And it was his mother's voice he heard, his mother's hand on his forehead, his mother promising him safety in a world that had felt safe back then, before he learned what death looked like up close. The soldier's singing faltered. His breathing had become labored, wet-sounding. The blood pooled wider around him. His face had gone the color of old paper. Winters lowered his rifle. He didn't make a conscious decision. His body simply refused the order his mind was trying to give. The weapon dropped to his side, still held loosely in one hand, barrel pointed at the ground. His other hand moved to his canteen, unclipping it from his belt with fingers that felt numb and distant. This was insane. This was against every protocol, every order, every instinct 3 years of war had carved into him. The man was the enemy. He'd been part of the patrol that had just killed Eddie and Tucker. He would have killed Winters without hesitation if their positions were reversed. But Winters couldn't do it, couldn't pull that trigger, couldn't end the song. He stepped forward slowly, boots crushing wet leaves, making no effort to hide his approach. The Japanese soldier's eyes opened, dark eyes, exhausted and pain-filled, focusing slowly on Winters' face. The singing stopped mid-phrase. They looked at each other for 3 heartbeats, 4, 5. The soldier's expression didn't change, no fear, no surprise, just a weary acceptance. The look of someone who'd already made peace with death and was simply waiting for it to arrive. Winters unscrewed his canteen, took 2 more steps forward, and knelt beside the dying man. He held the canteen to the soldier's lips, tilting it carefully. Water spilled over the man's chin, but some made it into his mouth. He swallowed with difficulty, once, twice, then turned his head away slightly. "Arigato," the soldier whispered. The word meant nothing to Winters. but the tone carried gratitude, confusion, a question that would never be answered. Winters set the canteen on the ground between them. He looked at the wound. The blood flow had slowed, which meant the man was running out of blood to lose. Minutes, maybe, not long. "Winters!" Sergeant Dalton's voice carried through the jungle, sharp with irritation. "Report!" Winters stood slowly, backing away from the soldier, his rifle hanging uselessly in his grip. The Japanese man's eyes followed him, dark and unreadable, the question still there. Why? Winters had no answer. Not one that made sense. Not one he could speak aloud. He turned and walked back toward the trail, leaving the enemy soldier propped against the banyan tree, alone with his wound and his canteen, and the silence of the jungle pressing in. Behind him, so faint he might have imagined it, the singing resumed. Softer now. Slower. Each word an effort. The lullaby followed Winters through the undergrowth, through the green shadows and hanging vines, a ghost of melody that sounded like his mother's voice, like comfort he'd forgotten existed, like something sacred the war had no right to touch. When he reached the trail, Dalton was smoking a cigarette, standing over Kowalski's body with an expression that held no emotion at all. Jackson and Miller were checking the enemy dead, collecting weapons and documents. "Right flank clear?" Dalton asked without looking up. Winters opened his mouth. The lie came easily, practiced, smooth as reflex. "Clear, Sergeant. All dead." Dalton nodded, flicked ash from his cigarette. "Good. Miller, strip the Japs for intel. Winters, Jackson, rig the bodies for recovery. We move in 10. Winters turned away before anyone could read his face. His hands were shaking again. And this time it had nothing to do with adrenaline. The canteen was gone from his belt. He'd have to report it lost, take the reaming from supply. A small price. As he helped Jackson lift Tucker's body, the lullaby still echoed in his mind, each note precise and unbearable, a melody that had crossed oceans and generations and the absolute divide of war to find him here, in this hell of green shadows and casual death, and force him to remember that he was human, that the enemy was human, that some things were too sacred to kill. The patrol moved out 12 minutes later, leaving the dead behind. Standard procedure. Recovery teams would come later, after the area was secured, after reconnaissance confirmed no enemy reinforcements were moving through the sector. Kowalski and Tucker would be wrapped in ponchos, tagged, and carried back to the rear for burial or shipment home. The Japanese bodies would be searched more thoroughly, then left for the jungle to claim. Winters walked forth in the column, behind Jackson and ahead of Miller, his rifle cradled across his chest, eyes scanning the green walls on either side of the trail. His body moved on autopilot. Step, pause. Scan, step. 3 years of repetition carved into muscle memory. But his mind was somewhere else entirely. The lullaby wouldn't stop. It played on an endless loop behind his thoughts, quiet but insistent, the same rising and falling pattern his mother had sung 2 decades ago in a farmhouse that didn't exist anymore. He couldn't shake it, couldn't silence it. Every time he tried to focus on the terrain ahead, on watching for tripwires or listening for movement in the undergrowth, the melody pulled him back. His canteen's absence felt like an accusation against his hip. What had he done? What had possessed him to show mercy to an enemy combatant in the middle of hostile territory? The man had been dying anyway. The water wouldn't save him, wouldn't even ease his pain significantly. It was a meaningless gesture, a violation of orders that served no strategic purpose, and could have gotten Winters killed if the soldier had been armed or faking the severity of his wounds. But Winters knew why he'd done it. He just couldn't articulate it, couldn't reduce it to words that would make sense to anyone else. The melody had unlocked something, a door he'd kept sealed for 16 years, since the morning he'd walked into his mother's room and found her cold and still, her hand hanging off the edge of the bed, fingers curled as if reaching for something just beyond her grasp. Sarah Winters, born Sarah Mitchell in 1898, married Robert Winters in 1919, died in 1929, 3 weeks after her 31st birthday, leaving behind a husband who would never smile again and a 7-year-old boy who would learn to stop crying because it made his father leave the room. Winters remembered the funeral. A small church outside Cleveland, maybe 40 people in attendance. his father's hand on his shoulder, gripping too hard. The minister saying things about God's plan and eternal rest. The coffin being lowered into frozen ground while snow fell in lazy spirals. He remembered coming home to a house that echoed, his father drinking coffee at the kitchen table, staring at nothing. The silence that stretched for days, then weeks, then became permanent. And he remembered trying to sing the lullaby to himself at night, alone in his narrow bed, trying to remember his mother's voice the exact way she'd shaped each note. But memory was imperfect, and within months the melody had faded, becoming something vague and distant, more feeling than sound, until today, until a dying Japanese soldier had sung it back to him across 20 years and 8,000 miles of separation. The column halted. Dalton raised a fist, the signal for silence and alert. Winters dropped to one knee automatically, weapon up, scanning the jungle. His heart rate barely increased. This was routine. They halted every 15 minutes, listened, moved on. But kneeling there in the mud, waiting for Dalton's all clear, Winters found himself thinking about the soldier's face. Young, probably not even 25, smooth-skinned despite the grime and exhaustion. The kind of face that should have been worried about crops or family obligations, not bleeding out in a jungle thousands of miles from home. Had he been singing to his mother? To a child? To a wife waiting in some village in Japan? Wondering if her husband would return. Winters would never know. The man would be dead by now. Had to be. That gut wound was fatal, the blood loss too severe. He'd die alone under the banyan tree, the canteen beside him, maybe still singing if he had the strength. Or maybe he'd already gone quiet. Eyes open to the green canopy above, seeing nothing, the lullaby unfinished. Dalton's hand dropped. The column rose and moved forward. They reached the rally point 2 hours before sunset, a clearing near a stream where the jungle thinned enough to allow visibility in all directions. Defensive positions were established quickly, 3 men on watch. The rest preparing cold rations and checking equipment. No fires, no talking above a whisper. They'd stay here until dawn, then push another 8 miles toward the coastal checkpoint where their company was dug in. Winters sat against a palm trunk, cleaning his rifle with methodical precision. The familiar ritual usually brought him a kind of meditation, a blank state where thought dissolved into pure action. Not tonight. Tonight his hands moved through the motions while his mind circled the same questions endlessly. "You okay?" Jackson settled beside him, unwrapping a tin of hash. "You've been quiet." Winters glanced at him. Private Leon Jackson. From Philadelphia, 21 years old, quick with a joke and quicker with his Thompson submachine gun. Good soldier. Decent man. They'd shared a tent for 8 months on Lady. "Tired," Winters said. "Yeah." Jackson spooned hash into his mouth without tasting it. Kowalski was a good kid. Tucker, too. Shit luck. "Yeah." They sat in silence for a while, eating without appetite, watching the shadows lengthen as the sun dropped behind the canopy. Somewhere in the jungle, a bird called, a harsh scraping sound that didn't belong in any peaceful forest. "You get the guy on the right flank?" Jackson asked casually. "Heard a shot after we cleared the trail." The lie should have come easily. Winters had already told it once to Dalton, but with Jackson sitting here in the growing darkness, the deception felt heavier. "He was already gone," Winters said. "Gut shot. Dead when I found him." Jackson nodded, scraping the last of his hash. "Mercy. Better than bleeding out slow." The words hung between them. Winters said nothing. He finished cleaning his rifle, reassembled it, loaded a fresh clip. The metal was cool against his palms, solid, real. The rifle was simple. You pointed it at the enemy and pulled the trigger. Clean mechanics. No ambiguity. Unlike memory. Unlike mercy. Unlike the moment when a dying man sang a lullaby and the whole architecture of war collapsed into something small and unbearably human. Night came fast in the jungle. One moment there was light, greenish and diffuse. The next, darkness folded in like a physical presence, thick enough to feel against your skin. The watch rotation began. Winters drew the midnight to 2 shift. He couldn't sleep anyway. He lay on his poncho, staring up at nothing, listening to the jungle's nocturnal chorus. Insects, distant animal calls, the occasional rustle of something moving through undergrowth. His mind refused to quiet. It kept returning to the banyan tree, to the blood pooling in roots, to dark eyes that had looked at him with confusion and gratitude. Why had the soldier been singing? What had prompted him, gut-shot and dying, to waste breath on a lullaby? Maybe he'd been delirious. Pain and blood loss could do that, could transport you backward into memory, into childhood, into the last moments you'd felt safe. Maybe he'd been singing to his mother, reaching back through time to a place before war existed, before he'd been conscripted into an army fighting a losing conflict on foreign soil. Or maybe he'd been singing to a child, his own, a daughter or son back in Japan, someone small who still believed their father was invincible, who waited for him to come home with the absolute faith that only children possess. Winters' mother had sung to him on the last night. In the bedroom that smelled of sickness and kerosene, with his father standing outside in the hallway because he couldn't bear to watch, she'd tried to sing. Her voice had been barely a whisper, breaking on every third word, but she'd tried, had pushed air through damaged lungs to give him that gift one final time, the promise that everything would be all right, that sleep was safe, that morning would come. She'd died 3 hours later. Winters had been asleep in his own room, dreaming of summer and the swimming hole near their farm. He hadn't been there when she'd gone, hadn't said goodbye properly. His father had woken him at dawn with a hand on his shoulder and 5 words, "Your mother's gone, son." Just like that. Gone. As if she'd left for the store and forgotten to come back. For years afterward, Winters had felt guilty about sleeping through her death. As if he should have stayed awake, should have been there holding her hand. As if his presence might have made a difference, might have kept her from slipping away. He understood now, 30 years old, lying in a jungle on the other side of the world, that his presence wouldn't have changed anything. Death came when it wanted, regardless of who was watching. But the guilt had shaped him anyway, had taught him that people you loved could disappear between one breath and the next, that safety was an illusion, that every goodbye might be final. His father had sold the farm in 1932. The Depression had made farming impossible, had taken what was left of his spirit and crushed it flat. They'd moved to Cleveland, where Robert Winters found work in a factory and drank himself quiet every evening. Winters had finished school, worked odd jobs, enlisted the day after Pearl Harbor. He hadn't been running toward something. He'd been running away from the silence of his father's house, from the ghost of his mother in every empty room, from the weight of grief that never lessened, just became familiar. And now, in this jungle, an enemy soldier had given him back the one thing he thought he'd lost forever, the sound of his mother's voice, the memory of safety, the melody that had once meant home. Midnight came. Winters took his watch position at the clearing's northern edge, settling into a shallow depression behind a fallen log. The darkness was absolute. Cloud cover had moved in, blocking stars and moon. He could see maybe 10 feet in front of him, and that only because his eyes had adjusted to the faint bioluminescence of rotting vegetation. 2 hours of staring into darkness, 2 hours of listening to every small sound and determining whether it was threat or environment. 2 hours alone with his thoughts. The lullaby played on. He tried to remember more about his mother. Specific moments, concrete details. But memory was treacherous, especially memory from childhood. What did he actually remember, and what had he reconstructed from photographs and his father's rare stories? He remembered her hands. She'd had long fingers, always moving, always occupied with some task. Kneading bread, mending shirts, braiding his hair before church. He remembered her laugh, though he couldn't hear it anymore, could only recall that it had been genuine and frequent. She'd found joy in small things, a well-risen loaf, a clean shirt snapping on the line, her son's drawings of horses and barns. He remembered her patience. She'd never raised her voice, never struck him in anger. When he'd tracked mud through the kitchen or broken a lamp playing indoor baseball, she'd simply cleaned up and explained quietly why certain things were important. He'd wanted to please her more than he'd feared punishment. And he remembered the singing. Every night, Without fail, she'd sat on the edge of his bed and sung, sometimes the lullaby, sometimes hymns from church, sometimes songs she'd learned from her own mother. Her voice had been unremarkable, average pitch, average tone, but to him it had been perfect, the sound that meant the day was finished and he was safe and tomorrow would bring new adventures. Until tomorrow didn't come. Until safe became a lie. Until her voice went silent forever and he learned that love, no matter how strong, couldn't prevent loss. A sound in the jungle. Winters' attention snapped back to the present. He raised his rifle, finger outside the trigger guard, breathing shallow. Listening. Nothing. Just the wind moving through leaves or an animal shifting position. Not human, not threat. He lowered the weapon slowly, forced his heartbeat to settle. What would his mother think of him now? Of the man he'd become? A soldier who'd killed. He'd stopped counting at 15. Couldn't remember most of their faces. A man who'd learned to sleep through artillery, to eat while surrounded by death, to function in an environment of constant violence without losing his mind. Would she be proud, ashamed, heartbroken? He'd like to think she'd understand, that she'd see he was doing what had to be done, that war wasn't about individual morality but about survival and duty and protecting the men beside you. But he suspected she'd see through that rationalization, would look at him with those patient eyes and ask the question he'd been avoiding. Who did you become, James? Not the boy she'd raised. That boy had believed in goodness and fairness and the basic decency of people. That boy had trusted that following rules and being kind would lead to a good life. That boy had died somewhere between Cleveland and the Pacific, replaced by someone harder, colder, more efficient. Someone who could shoot enemy soldiers without hesitation, who could step over corpses without flinching, who could reduce human beings to targets and threats and confirmed kills. Except tonight. Tonight, he'd failed at that reduction. Tonight, he'd seen the enemy as human, as someone's son, as a man who sang lullabies while dying alone in a jungle he'd probably never wanted to fight in, and he'd shown mercy. Meaningless, impractical, dangerous mercy that violated every rule and accomplished nothing except easing the conscience of one American corporal who couldn't pull a trigger while a dying man sang his mother's song. A rustling to his right. Winters turned his head slowly, keeping the rest of his body motionless. A shape moved through the darkness, small, low to the ground. Wild pig, probably, foraging through the clearing's edge. It snuffled at the earth, grunted softly, moved on. Winters watched it disappear into shadow. Life continuing, indifferent to human conflict. The jungle didn't care about war, about nations, about which side claimed moral superiority. It simply consumed everything equally, American and Japanese, victor and defeated, the righteous and the guilty. His watch ended at 2. Miller relieved him without conversation, settling into the depression with his rifle cradled and his eyes already adjusting to the dark. Winters returned to his poncho, lay down, closed his eyes. Sleep should have come. His body was exhausted, running on too little rest and too much adrenaline, but his mind refused, shut down. It played the same scene repeatedly. The banyan tree, the blood, the quiet singing. The choice to lower his weapon and offer water to a man he was supposed to kill. That choice would follow him. He knew this with certainty. It would become one of those moments that defined him, that he'd return to again and again in the years ahead, examining from every angle, trying to understand why he'd done what he'd done. Because the truth was, he didn't understand it himself, not fully, not in a way he could explain to Dalton or Jackson or any of the men who'd trusted him to do his job, to eliminate threats, to protect the squad by removing enemies before they could regroup and attack again. He'd failed that trust, and he'd do it again, given the same circumstances. That was what unsettled him most, the certainty that if he found himself in that moment again, with a dying enemy singing a lullaby, he'd make the same choice. Lower his weapon, offer water, walk away. Because some things were sacred, some memories were inviolable, and his mother's lullaby, sung by an enemy soldier on the other side of the world, was both. Dawn came slowly, gray light filtering through the canopy, turning darkness into shades of green. The column prepared to move, gear stowed, weapons checked, positions abandoned. They'd cover 8 miles today, pushing toward the checkpoint where the company waited. Winters fell into line, 4th position, his rifle ready and his mind elsewhere. As they moved out, he found himself listening to the jungle, waiting for something he knew he wouldn't hear. A voice singing softly in Japanese, a melody that sounded like home, a ghost of comfort in the green hell surrounding them. The lullaby followed him into the day, into the heat and humidity and grinding exhaustion of another patrol through enemy territory. It would follow him much farther than that, he suspected. It would follow him home, whenever home finally came. It would follow him into whatever life waited on the other side of war. And somewhere behind them, under a banyan tree with roots like a cage, a young Japanese soldier lay dead with an American canteen beside him, his last breath shaped into a song that had crossed oceans and generations to remind one enemy of his humanity. That song would haunt Winters for 50 years, but first, it would save him from becoming something he couldn't live with, something his mother wouldn't recognize. The column reached the checkpoint at 14:30 hours, 3 hours behind schedule due to difficult terrain and 2 additional enemy contacts, both brief firefights that left no American casualties and 4 more Japanese dead. Winters hadn't fired his weapon in either engagement. The checkpoint was a fortified position carved into a hillside overlooking a river valley. Sandbag bunkers, machine gun nests, communication trenches connecting fighting positions. 200 men from Baker Company held this ground, the westernmost point of the American advance before the terrain became too hostile for sustained operations. Dalton reported to the company commander while the patrol dispersed to their assigned areas. Winters found his tent, a sagging canvas structure he shared with Jackson and 2 other riflemen, and dropped his gear on his cot. His body ached. 3 days of patrol, minimal sleep, constant tension. He should have collapsed immediately into unconsciousness. Instead, he sat on the edge of his cot, staring at nothing, the lullaby still playing behind his thoughts. "Chow's in 20, Jackson said, ducking through the tent flap. "You coming?" "Yeah." "You sure? You look like shit, Winters. Maybe hit the aid station. Get something to help you sleep." "I'm fine." Jackson studied him for a moment, unconvinced, then shrugged. "Your funeral. Don't blame me when you collapse face first into your beans." He left. Winters sat in the empty tent, listening to the camp sounds filtering through canvas, men talking, equipment clanking, a radio playing music from Armed Forces Network, someone laughing at a joke he couldn't hear. Normal sounds. The sounds of soldiers between combat, relaxing in the brief windows of safety, trying to remember they were human beings with lives and futures and reasons to survive. Winters couldn't access that normalcy, couldn't pretend everything was fine, couldn't joke with Jackson or eat beans or care about the baseball scores crackling through the radio. The banyan tree held him, the dying soldier's eyes, the melody that had stripped away 3 years of careful numbness and left him raw. He needed to know if the man was dead. The thought arrived fully formed, urgent, irrational. What difference did it make? Dead or alive, the soldier was behind them, unreachable, irrelevant to whatever came next. Knowing his fate wouldn't change anything, wouldn't undo Winters' choice or explain it or make it right. But he needed to know. He found Dalton in the command bunker, studying maps with Lieutenant Harrison, the platoon leader. They looked up when Winters ducked through the entrance. "Corporal." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "Something wrong?" "Sir, request permission to speak with Sergeant Dalton. Private matter." Harrison glanced at Dalton, who nodded. The lieutenant gathered his maps and left, giving them space. Dalton lit a cigarette, leaned against the bunker wall. "Talk." Winters chose his words carefully. "The right flank yesterday. The Japanese soldier by the tree. I told you he was dead. And he wasn't. Not when I found him." The silence stretched. Dalton's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. Calculation, assessment, the weighing of consequences. "Gut shot," Winters continued. "Bleeding out. Maybe 10 minutes left, maybe 20. I gave him water and moved on." "You gave him water?" "Yes, Sergeant." "And then left him there?" "Yes." Another silence. Dalton drew on his cigarette, exhaled smoke toward the bunker's low ceiling. Why? It was the question Winters had been asking himself. He still didn't have a good answer, not one that would satisfy a sergeant who'd spent 4 years keeping men alive by enforcing discipline and following protocol. He was singing, Winters said quietly. A lullaby. Same melody my mother used to sing, different language, same tune, and I couldn't. He trailed off. Couldn't pull the trigger. No, Sergeant. Dalton smoked in silence, his face unreadable. Finally, he dead now? Had to be. That wound was fatal. So your mercy bought him what? An extra hour of pain? The words hit like a fist, because Dalton was right. The water hadn't saved the soldier, hadn't eased his suffering significantly. It had just prolonged his dying, left him alone in the jungle to bleed out slowly instead of ending it quickly and cleanly. I don't know why I did it, Winters admitted. It was stupid, dangerous, against orders. But I couldn't kill a man while he was singing. Dalton finished his cigarette, ground it out under his boot. You told me he was dead. Lied to your sergeant. That's a problem. Yes, Sergeant. But you're telling me now. Why? Because I need to know if he's dead. Need to confirm it. Dalton's laugh was short and humorless. You want to go back? Walk 5 miles through enemy territory to check on a Jap you should have shot in the first place? No, Sergeant. But if there's a patrol heading that direction, if reconnaissance is sweeping the area for recovery, you want intel on a dead enemy soldier who doesn't matter to anyone. Yes. Dalton studied him for a long moment. Then, surprisingly, he nodded. There's a patrol heading out at 600 tomorrow. Different route, but they'll pass within a mile of yesterday's ambush site. I'll tell them to check your banyan tree, see if there's a body. Thank you, Sergeant. Don't thank me. And Winters, don't lie to me again. You got questions about your own choices, you work through them. But you don't compromise squad integrity with dishonesty. Clear? Clear, Sergeant. Dismissed. Winters left the bunker feeling worse than when he'd entered. Dalton was right about everything. The lie, the meaningless mercy, the self-indulgent need for confirmation. What did it matter if the soldier was dead? What would that knowledge change? But he couldn't let it go. The not knowing gnawed at him. He skipped chow, returned to his tent, lay on his cot staring at canvas overhead. Jackson came back eventually, tried to engage him in conversation about the patrol, the checkpoint defenses, rumors of a major offensive being planned. Winters responded with monosyllables until Jackson gave up and left him alone. Night fell. The camp settled into its nocturnal routine, reduced activity, enhanced watch rotations, the constant background noise of war never entirely absent. Artillery rumbled in the distance. Somewhere east, bombers droned overhead on their way to targets deeper in enemy territory. Winters didn't sleep. He lay in darkness, replaying the moment endlessly. The soldier's face, the blood, the quiet singing, the choice to lower his weapon, over and over, examining it from every angle, trying to understand what it meant about him, about war, about the line between soldier and human being. At some point in the early hours, exhaustion finally pulled him under. He slept badly, dreaming of his mother's funeral, of snow falling on frozen ground, of a coffin being lowered while a Japanese soldier sang in the distance. He woke before dawn, gritty-eyed and unrested. The patrol left at 0600 as scheduled. 8 men under Sergeant Kowalski's brother, Tommy, who'd transferred to Baker Company after Eddie's death. They were sweeping the area for intelligence, mapping enemy positions, checking for signs of reinforcement. And they'd pass the banyan tree. Winters spent the day on guard duty, manning a machine gun position overlooking the river valley, watching for movement, seeing nothing but jungle and heat shimmer. His mind was elsewhere. His thoughts kept drifting to the patrol, to the tree, to what they'd find. The patrol returned at 17:30 hours. Winters was off duty by then, sitting outside his tent cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that day. He saw Tommy Kowalski heading toward the command bunker and intercepted him. Kowalski. Tommy turned. His face was harder than his brother's had been. Grief and anger mixed into something cold. Winters. Dalton said you were checking an area from yesterday's patrol. The banyan tree on the right flank. Yeah, we checked it. Was there a body? Tommy's expression shifted. Confusion, then something like understanding. Japanese soldier, gut shot. Dead maybe 12 hours. He had an American canteen next to him. Winters' chest tightened. Just one body? Just one. Why? You lose track of your kills? Something like that. Tommy studied him for a moment, then reached into his pack and pulled out a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Found this on him. Thought maybe it was worth keeping. Intelligence might want it. He handed the bundle to Winters. It was lighter than expected, the cloth stained with old blood. Winters unwrapped it carefully. A photograph. Black and white, creased and faded. A young Japanese man in civilian clothes standing next to a woman holding an infant. Behind them, a small house with a garden. The man was smiling, not the soldier's face Winters had seen under the banyan tree, but younger, softer, untouched by war. The same man, before. There was more, Tommy said. Letters, personal effects, but the photograph seemed, I don't know, important. Winters stared at the image. The woman looked tired but happy. The baby was maybe 6 months old, eyes wide, one tiny fist raised. A family, a home, a life before everything collapsed into war and conscription and dying alone in a jungle 8,000 miles from everyone you loved. He was singing. Winters said quietly, "When I found him, a lullaby." Tommy was silent for a moment. Eddie used to sing. When he was nervous before combat, he'd sing this stupid song from some radio show. Drove me crazy. His voice roughened. I'd give anything to hear it again. He walked away before Winters could respond, heading toward the command bunker with his report, leaving Winters standing outside his tent with a dead man's photograph in his hands. The woman and child in the picture would never see him again, would wait for letters that stopped coming, for a return that would never happen. They'd receive a telegram or a visit from an officer, would learn that husband and father had died on some nameless island in the Pacific, fighting for an empire that had sent him to die for nothing. And in his final moments, he'd been singing to them, reaching across impossible distance, using his last breath to send them comfort, to promise them, falsely, desperately, that everything would be all right. Winters carefully rewrapped the photograph and took it to the command bunker. Lieutenant Harrison was alone, writing reports by lantern light. He looked up when Winters entered. "Corporal?" "Sir, this was recovered from an enemy casualty. Thought it should go through intelligence channels. Maybe Red Cross. In case it can be returned to his family after the war." Harrison took the bundle, unwrapped it, studied the photograph. His expression softened slightly. "This the soldier from yesterday's patrol? The one Sergeant Dalton mentioned?" "Yes, sir. You didn't shoot him. It wasn't a question." Winters stood at attention, waiting for whatever came next. Reprimand, discipline, consequences for showing mercy to the enemy. Harrison set the photograph on his desk, looked at Winters directly. "I lost my brother at Normandy. He was 22. Wanted to be a teacher. Last letter I got from him. He wrote about missing Mom's cooking and his girlfriend's laugh in the quiet of Sunday mornings." He paused. "I never got to say goodbye. Never got to tell him anything that mattered. Sir, you gave that Japanese soldier time. Maybe he used it to make peace, to finish his song, to think about his family one last time. Maybe that's worth something. Or maybe it's worth nothing. I don't know. But I'm not going to court-martial you for showing mercy to a dying man." Harrison picked up the photograph again. "I'll make sure this goes through proper channels. If there's any way to get it back to his family, Red Cross will handle it." "Thank you." "Sir." "Dismissed, Corporal." "And Winters? Don't make a habit of second-guessing yourself. This war needs soldiers who can pull the trigger when necessary. You've proven you can do that. One moment of mercy doesn't change who you are." But Harrison was wrong. It had changed something. Winters felt it as he left the bunker. Felt the shift in how he understood himself, the war, the enemy across the wire. The Japanese soldier hadn't become less of an enemy, but he'd become more of a person. And that distinction mattered more than Winters wanted to admit. The days that followed were routine, patrols, guard duty, maintenance, the grinding rhythm of military life between major operations. Winters performed his duties mechanically, efficiently, but the lullaby never left him. It played constantly in the back of his mind, a ghost melody that reminded him of home, of loss, of the thin line between soldier and human being. He started having trouble sleeping. When exhaustion finally pulled him under, he dreamed of the banyan tree, of dark eyes watching him, of singing that wouldn't stop even when the singer was dead. Jackson noticed. "You need to talk to somebody, man. Chaplain, maybe, or the doc. You're not right." "I'm fine." "You're not. You haven't been since that patrol. Something happened out there." Winters didn't answer. How could he explain that he was haunted by mercy, by the choice not to kill, by a melody that had reminded him he was capable of compassion in an environment designed to eliminate it? 3 weeks later, the war ended. August 15th, 1945. Japan surrendered. The news came through on the radio. The Emperor's voice, speaking directly to his people for the first time, announcing defeat. In the American positions, men cheered, fired weapons into the air, embraced each other with relief and disbelief. The killing was over. They'd survived. Winters sat outside his tent, listening to the celebration, feeling nothing. The war's end should have brought joy, release, the promise of going home. Instead, he felt hollowed out, displaced, uncertain what came next, because the war had ended. But his war, the internal conflict sparked by a dying enemy's lullaby, continued. That wouldn't end with surrender documents or occupation duties or the long journey back to the States. The weeks of occupation duty passed slowly. Winters was assigned to reconstruction efforts, helping organize supply distribution in Japanese villages, ensuring civilians received food and medicine. He saw children playing in rubble, women searching wreckage for salvageable possessions, old men staring at nothing with empty eyes. The enemy, up close, looked like people who'd lost everything, like the woman in the photograph, waiting for a husband who'd never return, like the child who'd never know their father except through stories and faded images. Winters carried the memory of the photograph with him, wondered if it had reached the family, if Lieutenant Harrison had followed through. He hoped so. It seemed important that they have that image back, proof that their soldier had existed, had been loved, had mattered to someone. In October, Winters' unit received orders to ship out. They'd be home by Christmas, the promise every soldier had clung to through the war's darkest moments. The journey back took 3 weeks, crossing the Pacific on a converted transport, arriving in San Francisco to cheering crowds and welcome home ceremonies. It felt unreal, distant, like something happening to someone else. Winters was discharged in early November. He took a train to Cleveland, arrived at his father's small apartment unannounced. His father opened the door, looked at him for a long moment, then nodded once. "You're back." "Yeah, Dad, I'm back." They sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee, not talking about the war or the years of separation or anything that mattered. Just surface conversations about weather and the factory where his father still worked, and neighbors who'd died or moved away. Winters lasted 3 days before he couldn't stand the silence anymore. He left Cleveland, drifted for a while, took odd jobs in different cities, tried to figure out who he was now that he wasn't a soldier. The answer eluded him. He felt disconnected from civilian life, from the concerns and routines that occupied everyone around him. They cared about baseball scores and new cars and movie stars. He cared about nothing, felt nothing except the persistent echo of a lullaby he couldn't forget. Years passed. Winters moved through life like a ghost, present but not engaged. He worked construction, then factory jobs, then finally settled in Michigan as a tool and die maker. He married briefly in 1952, a kind woman named Ruth who tried to reach the part of him that had remained in the Pacific. The marriage lasted 2 years before she left, gently, saying she couldn't love someone who wasn't really there. She was right. He wasn't there. Part of him had stayed under a banyan tree, watching a dying enemy sing a lullaby, unable to pull the trigger, unable to become the killer the war demanded. Decades passed. The war receded into history, became something studied in schools, commemorated on holidays, reduced to statistics and strategic analysis. Winters grew old quietly, working his job, living alone, keeping his war memories to himself. He never forgot the lullaby. In 1995, 50 years after the war ended, Winters received a letter. The envelope was thin, covered in foreign stamps, the return address written in characters he couldn't read. Inside, a single page written in careful English. Dear Mr. Winters, my name is Akiko Yamada. I am writing to you from Hokkaido, Japan. The Red Cross has helped me locate your address through military records. I hope this letter finds you well. In 1947, my family received a photograph from the American occupation forces. It showed my father, Kenji Yamada, with my mother and myself as an infant. The photograph had been found on my father's body after he died in combat in the Philippines in June 1945. For many years, I wondered about my father. I was too young to remember him. My mother told me stories, but stories are not the same as knowing someone. The photograph was our only proof that he had lived, had loved us, had existed as more than a name on a military record. Recently, I discovered something extraordinary. The Red Cross file that returned the photograph included a note from an American lieutenant stating that the photograph had been given to him by a corporal who wished to ensure it reached my family. The lieutenant wrote that this corporal had encountered my father in his final moments and had shown him mercy. I do not know if you are that corporal. The records are incomplete, and I have spent 5 years searching. But if you are, I want you to know something. My mother died believing my father had suffered terribly in his final hours. She carried that pain until her death in 1982. But I choose to believe something different. I believe that because of someone's mercy, perhaps yours, my father died with dignity. That someone saw him as human, not just as an enemy. That someone chose compassion when cruelty would have been easier. If you are that person, I want to thank you. For the photograph, for the mercy, for allowing my father's last moments to be something other than violence. I am now a grandmother myself. I have taught my children and grandchildren that enemies are still human beings. That mercy matters. That one act of kindness can ripple across decades and oceans. My father used to sing to me. My mother told me this, a lullaby his own mother had taught him. I sing the same song to my grandchildren now. The melody continues. With deepest gratitude, Akiko Yamada Winters read the letter 3 times, hands shaking, tears streaming down his face. The first tears he'd shed since his mother's funeral, 66 years earlier. The soldier had been singing to his daughter, to Akiko, across impossible distance, using his final breath to send her the promise of safety, the comfort of a father's love, the melody that said, "You are not alone. I love you. Sleep peacefully." Winters had let him finish that song, had given him minutes, meaningless, precious minutes, to complete that final gift to his child. And somehow, 50 years later, that child had found him, had reached across the decades to say, "Your mercy mattered. Thank you." He wrote back immediately, a simple letter explaining what had happened under the banyan tree, how her father had been singing, how the melody had sounded like his own mother's lullaby, how he'd been unable to pull the trigger because some things were too sacred to kill. They corresponded for 3 years. Letters crossing the Pacific, building a bridge between former enemies, between a daughter who'd never known her father and a soldier who'd shown him mercy in his final moments. In 1998, Akiko visited Michigan. She was 73, gray-haired and dignified, carrying a photograph of her father, the same image Winters had given to Lieutenant Harrison half a century earlier. They sat in Winters' small apartment, 2 elderly people who'd been connected by war and mercy in a lullaby that had transcended everything. "He was a good man," Akiko said quietly. "My mother always told me this. He did not want to fight. He was conscripted, forced to leave his farm, sent to die for an empire he did not believe in. I'm sorry," Winters said, "for your loss, for the war, for everything. You gave him dignity. That is not something to apologize for." She stayed for 3 days. They talked about the war, about their lives, about loss and survival, and the strange grace of unexpected connections. On the last evening, she asked him something. "Will you sing it for me? The lullaby?" Winters hadn't sung in decades. His voice was rough, uncertain, But he tried, humming the melody his mother had sung 70 years earlier, the same pattern of notes that had stopped him from pulling a trigger under a banyan tree in 1945. Akiko closed her eyes, listening. When he finished, she sang it back to him in Japanese, the words different, the melody identical. "My father's last gift," she said softly, "passed to me through you." She left the next morning. They embraced at the door. Two people who should have been enemies, connected instead by mercy and music, and the recognition that humanity transcends war. Winters lived 4 more years. He died peacefully in 2002, age 85, in a veterans' care facility in Detroit. Among his few possessions, the staff found a worn letter from Japan and a faded photograph of a young Japanese soldier with his wife and infant daughter. At his funeral, attended by a handful of fellow veterans and distant relatives, a woman none of them recognized arrived late. She was elderly, Japanese, carrying flowers. She stood at the grave after everyone else had left, and she sang, a quiet lullaby in a language none of the cemetery workers understood. The melody drifted across the headstones, across the decades, across the ocean of grief and war and impossible mercy that had brought two enemies together and transformed them into something more. The song continued. It always would. Passed from mother to son, from father to daughter, from enemy to enemy until they were no longer enemies at all, just people sharing the same simple truth. Some memories are too sacred for violence. Some melodies transcend war, and mercy, once given, ripples forward through time, touching lives that will never know its source, but will feel its weight nonetheless. Under a banyan tree in a jungle that no longer exists, on an island whose name has faded from maps and memory, a young soldier once sang a lullaby while dying. And another soldier, enemy by circumstance, chose to listen rather than kill. That choice saved them both. Not from death. Death came anyway, eventually, as it comes for everyone, but from becoming something their mothers wouldn't recognize. From losing the part of themselves that remembered safety and love and the simple comfort of a song sung in darkness to keep fear away. James Winters carried that song for 57 years, and when he finally laid it down, he passed it forward, to a daughter who'd never known her father, to grandchildren who would learn that enemies are human, to generations yet unborn who would inherit the lesson. War demands soldiers, but humanity demands something more. Sometimes in the space between trigger pull and mercy, in the moment when a dying enemy sings and a living soldier listens, the war loses, and everyone, impossibly, wins.